Let's have a conversation. I posted something to Facebook, and I'm just going to read it for you. I said, how can healthcare be a human right if you require someone to produce the tools, do the research, and provide the care? How can housing be a human right if the house must be built and maintained? If you're alone in the middle of the woods, you retain all of your basic human rights, speech, expression, freedom, etc. Pursue happiness, no one's going to stop you. But alone in the woods, there are no doctors, there are no builders. So how is it a right to have something that must be produced by someone else? These are not rhetorical questions. I'm looking for an actual conversation. And surprise, people had a real conversation. There are a lot of people on the right who say, you're spot on, Tim, it can't be. Well, I'm not looking for confirmation from conservatives. I'm looking for an actual argument from progressives. And there are some pretty good ones. There was one that I like in particular. This person, Nate Simintov, said, you have a right to bear arms. It doesn't mean I need to give you a gun. And I started to realize maybe the way I'm thinking about what they mean by healthcare as a human right is wrong. And so I responded, so you're saying a right to healthcare means you can't be denied, but that no one has to provide it for you? I said that's a different opinion to the Medicare for All DSA, right, Democratic Socialists. But I think that's where the confusion comes in. Based on that, I started thinking about it and I was like, yeah, I think when you think about it that way, healthcare is a human right. You have a right to bear arms, maybe not a human right, but a constitution. Maybe it should be a constitutional right. And here's what I mean by that. You have a constitutional right to bear arms. No one is going to give you guns. Okay, you have to pay for them. It just means that the government can't stop you from getting guns. So in that sense, if the government is going to guarantee healthcare, the right to access to healthcare, then the government can't stop you from getting healthcare, but no one has to provide it to you. That is a very different argument from Medicare for All, right? Typically when people say healthcare is a human right, what they're saying is the government should provide it to everybody. And my argument is you can't guarantee that. A lot of people misunderstand or don't seem to understand that resources have to come from somewhere. And so there are some other arguments that I want to pull up. Before I get into the far left argument specifically about why it should be granted to everybody, I wanted to pull up David Pakman, who commented in here. David Pakman is I believe liberal is the correct way to identify David. I don't want to mislabel him, so you can look him up. But he has a podcast show on YouTube. He said, "You're sort of mixed up in the human rights semantics rather than the underlying meaning. Yes, healthcare exists only in societies. So if you go back to a state of nature in the woods, healthcare as a right sounds silly. But if considered more, quote, a right that some societies in modernity will provide to all humans, you get around the semantics that, as you point out, make it more of a linguistic debate rather than one about how people in modern societies can be treated." And then I went on to agree that basically what I just said before, that the government can't stop you from getting healthcare, that you should have the right to get healthcare, but that you shouldn't. You still have to pay for it. And that makes sense to me. A lot of people seem to think that there's a thing called free healthcare. There is not. If you happen to be somebody who is on the left and you want to talk about healthcare as a human right, let me just say right now, nowhere on the planet is there free healthcare. Okay? There are systems that are paid for through involuntary taxation. What I try explaining to people about healthcare is when you think about a provider. Let's say you've got an insurance provider, I can't think of a company, Blue Cross, Blue Shield, whatever, is that a company? And you pay them. And then they guarantee that if you go to a hospital, you have certain things that are covered because of the agreement you made with them. With government healthcare, it's basically the same thing. You pay your monthly subscription fee, which is a tax, and then you are granted healthcare. The difference, when it comes to getting insurance, private insurance, you can get different tiers. Some tiers are more expensive, but grant you different deductibles and more access. Some people can't afford them. They don't get it at all. The idea of government is that if you can afford to pay more, you do pay more, but you still get the same level of care. And if you can't afford to pay, you still get the same level of care. So it's still being paid for. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that granting healthcare to literally everybody, saying it's a right, means that money has to come from somewhere. Typically, that means you're going to take money from people who are wealthier and give it to people who are not as wealthy. There are some areas where I find that acceptable, and healthcare is one of them. Though I don't believe in only doing a national healthcare service, I do think it's fair to have a public option that people can choose to pay into. And I do think it's fair to try and figure out a way that we can, maybe, I don't want to stay too much on healthcare to make this point, but I want to just say something very simply. As a civilized society, I think we should focus on investing in our poor communities, because you've got a lot of people who can't afford education, who can't afford healthcare, who are sick, who are dying, who don't have access to food and opportunity. And that's an opportunity for investment. So I'll look at it this way. Let's say you have a poor, just totally like broken down neighborhood. Houses are falling apart. Investors look at that and say, if we put money in that, those houses will be nice and then be worth more money, and I'll profit off of that. And I think of it in a very similar way that our country should be doing. It becomes a challenge then when you start telling people they have to pay taxes, but we do live in a democratic republic, in which case if politicians vote in a certain direction, you can be upset about it, but that's a system we're in. And I know a lot of people are upset about increased taxes, so that's why it's important to be active in politics. But the way I see it is, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to education, there is a point at which we should be like, let's all, as a society, take some of our resources and pool it into investment into those who are poor and without resources, so that they can become more valuable and then produce more, ultimately making the standard of living in this country much, much better for everybody. There's an individualist versus collectivist, debate within that. I'm not arguing the scope at which we tax people, but as you all know, I am a liberal, and I do believe that to a certain extent, people should pitch in, and we should use it as a collective to reinvest into certain areas. I don't go so far as the democratic socialists for the most part, because as I said, I'm a liberal, not a socialist. But I do think, on a smaller scale, we can look at it like this. If you live in a city and you have a neighborhood with just destroyed roads, buildings are falling apart, you need to fix that, okay? And if you live in that city, you can't just say, well, it's not my neighborhood, it's not my backyard. Communities have to work together. I think one of the arguments is, to what scale does our community work together? It's fine if you want to be 100% individualist, libertarian, focused on yourself, your friends, and your family. I agree with that. But there is a concern when society puts pressures on each other. And I'll explain this with a road analogy. There will come a point where a service you are granted, be it plumbing, be it delivery, maybe you went to the store and you bought bread. Okay. That truck that delivered that bread may have driven on roads in a neighborhood that isn't yours. So we have to think about the impact our actions and our desires have on a larger scale. Ultimately, I think the argument is just, it floats back and forth left and right. Conservatives tend to be more of a, going private route. Liberals tend to be more of a government route. I'm only slightly, on my 8 values test, I'm at 54% equality and 46% markets, because free markets need to exist. But we do need to recognize the areas that aren't being adequately serviced by the market, because it does happen, and then we need to solve that problem. Let's get back to the healthcare as a human right. There was another person that I wanted to bring up. Well, let's go with this one. They said, this is a straw man argument. You're attacking the notion that these things are a human right, rather than attacking the idea that we could very well cut military just a smidge, end the drug war and mass incarceration, and find ourselves with more than enough money to provide every citizen with these things easily. Straw man. My argument is not a straw man. I am not arguing that we should or should not pay for it. What I'm arguing is that, how is it a human right? A right is different from a service, right? The post office is a government service. We pay taxes into that. That's not a right. National health services are not rights. They are services. You pay for them. Speech is a right. The government can't stop someone from speaking, in most instances. One of the arguments that tends to be outside of the semantics is this from my friend Isabel, that we as a civilized society, we decide that taking care of each other, we decide to view taking care of each other as a human right. Well, I think some people in the society do, but I do think it's a minority. She said that if you're part of a society, whether you live or die should not be dependent on wealth or anything else. That's not to say that people who contribute should be compensated the same way any other profession is compensated for their efforts. Where we have gone wrong, though, is letting certain groups of people, pharmaceutical companies, insurance companies, amass an exorbitant amount of wealth at the expense of people's health. And really, what it comes down to is our society is only as strong as our poorest people. So if we don't focus on people's health and well-being, then we create a society of massive wealth and massive property, which to me is sort of embarrassing and not really the progressive, productive society I think most Americans want to be a part of. Additionally, our healthcare system is so ridiculous right now that people who make a good living are still struggling to pay for their healthcare. We're not even benefiting the average person. Even the wealthiest people still pay a ton for their healthcare, and though it may not bankrupt them, as far as I can tell, they're not benefiting from the system either, save those who invest in pharmaceuticals or have some other corrupt way of profiting off of it. Which is why I have a hard time figuring out why the whole country isn't ready to fix this system. I responded with, my insurance is like $300 a month and it covers basically nothing. I can't remember what I was getting. It was a physical and some dental work, and it was like, yeah, your insurance is worthless. And I was like, what's the point of having it? Why am I spending money on something that doesn't do anything for me? And there was some debate from some financial person, I just can't remember who, where they did the math and said that in the next 3 years, they're going to pay, tens of thousands of dollars, and even if they use the insurance, will not get back that much, in which case, why don't they put that money into a savings account and then have a retirement fund when they end up not needing it? And so there is a good point. I will say that a lot of Isabel's argument, I think, it hits on the point the left makes that we're a civilized society and we should guarantee people access to healthcare. We shouldn't tell people that if you don't make the money, then you die. And I gotta say, as a liberal, I agree with that to a point. That we pay taxes for the police and the fire department. Why shouldn't we have something that's kind of like healthcare in a similar vein? I will point out, though, ultimately, I don't think I'm knowledgeable enough on the issue to actually say we need to do one thing or the other. That's an important point I need to make on this. I do agree with the idea that people should have a basic level of service that we should pitch in. But ultimately, the idea of a human right comes down to a semantic debate that I guess this is the main point I need to get to in this whole video. The people on the left are calling it a human right, and the people on the right are saying it's not. And then I think really the left is just using improper language. A right is something that has to be guaranteed to you. There's positive rights, there's negative rights, and saying that society will give you something requires taking from somebody else. There are some people who say we can cut the military budget and provide these services, right? But that's not the point. The point is, if if there's no doctor, you can't give someone healthcare. If there's no construction worker, you can't give someone a house. So you can't guarantee it as a right. You can guarantee a service to your population, and you can force them to pay for it. So this is the big conundrum. Ultimately, I think the left argument is really a progressive one. It does lean towards socialism, that wealth and property aren't the most important things. But I also think it is a fair point that big corporations like pharmaceuticals, insurance companies amass tons of profit, make a ton of money off of people's health. And when it comes to the argument that they shouldn't be allowed to do it, it's simply an opinion. It really is. It's not a fact-based argument. When it comes down to a lot of the left versus right rhetoric, people need to realize it isn't necessarily about the facts. Ben Shapiro says facts don't care about your feelings. That's fine, but opinions exist. And a lot of our policy is based on what people think should or should not be in terms of rights. Isabel doesn't like the idea that pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies amass exorbitant wealth at the cost, by having these services, by spending money in this direction. And there are people on the right who think it's totally fine that companies profit off of providing healthcare because the market will benefit in the long run. The United States has made strides in developing new medical technologies that a lot of countries don't have. Anyway, let me give you my final assessment, and we can carry on with the idea of rights and all that stuff, and you can comment below. I don't think it's a right, and I don't think even these people think it's a right either. I think what they're really saying is that our society is safe enough that the government should provide this as a guaranteed service, which is different from a fundamental human right. I think it's just an issue of semantics. Anyway, let's have a debate. Comment, and yes, I do read the comments on this. We'll have a debate over healthcare. I gotta say one last thing. I'm so proud of this thread. There were a few stupid comments from people calling me, saying like, healthcare is a human right, you bigot. But for the most part, right and left are in here giving their honest thoughts, and this is awesome. So I hope you guys do the same. Stick around. I may or may not have another video in half an hour, but you'll see if I do.